That's me.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this month's webinar, Reading the Room, presented by the North American Cambridge Classics Project and supported by Cambridge University Press. We are so delighted to welcome Stefanie Gigante as our presenter this evening. Stefanie serves on the NACCP board and is a regular webinar presenter and a summer workshop presenter. She and S.K. Smith did several webinars for Cambridge University Press last spring on the new digital resources for the 6th edition, and then they did a follow-up webinar at the end of August, and we hope you will check those out if you are interested in the new materials on 6th edition. Stefanie teaches at Ridgewood High School in New Jersey. She serves as the Technology Innovation Specialist in the district, and she's also a certified Google and Pear Deck trainer, and probably several other things that I haven't listed. She presents frequently at conferences regarding technology integration and language classroom best practices. So we welcome her this evening. And we also would like to remind you that we are recording this session. And if you need a professional development certificate for the webinar, just please email us training@cambridgelatin.org and we'll get a certificate to you very quickly.
And we'd like to remind you that this is the first of 3 fall webinars. The next 2 will be, Joe is talking about all the cool things you can find about patterns and grammar throughout the 3 books, 3 of the books at this point. And then Natalie, at the very beginning of December, is going to talk about ancient cryptology, how people, communicated their own little secret messages. And it's something you can do with your students. I'm going to put the links to both of them in the chat. If you haven't signed up, it might be a good idea to do it tonight or copy the link anyway. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing and Stefanie, you've got the floor or the screen.
All right, thanks. Okay, I am going to start my presentation. I'm also going to put into the chat a link to the presentation so that if you'd like to look at it on your own screen, you can feel free to do so. And feel free to jump in too and ask questions throughout. I'm a bit of a yapatron, as my son would call me, but I'm more than happy to take a moment to address any queries that you have or, provide clarification on whatever you need. So welcome to our first webinar in our fall series. I've termed it Reading the Room for a couple different reasons that we will talk about too. So that's my email address. It's on the first and the last slide. So if you have a follow-up question, if something is marinating in your brain tonight and you want to run it by me, please feel free to reach out. So I was framing this through a certain lens, and that is what's at stake. And the most important thing for all of us here tonight is that Cambridge Latin course, which we all use every day for all of our classes, it offers a reading-based approach for acquiring Latin. And this is not news to anyone, but it's our fundamental, our bread and butter, as they say. However, we are up against some pretty startling statistics, of which I found varying degrees of startle. So I have a couple of degrees of startle here for you. One is that apparently only 16% of American adults read for pleasure on any given day. I recognize that those are adults versus students or children, but that is kind of a harrowing statistic because that means that most people in the adult world, 84% of them, are mostly reading for, perhaps consumption of news or only for their job, but not necessarily for the pleasure and the curiosity that is inherent in reading. I am biased, but also proud to say that I am in the 16%. I do read regularly. And I think that this is an important, if you do as well, I think this is an important skill to show to your students as well, because I think that they need to know that if you are in the 16% or whatever percent you might have for a more updated statistic, that you are reading for purpose of pleasure and for the purpose of edification and for the purpose of broadening your mind and, living in another world. And then you can also use that as, a jumping off point for conversations and discussions with your students too about the books that they're reading, etc. One of my sources of pride, to be honest, a few years ago, I finally got like a new whiteboard that was just, I'm putting it on a bulletin board in my classroom. And on that little whiteboard, I write and I update it regularly, whatever I'm reading. I have this question, quem librum magistra legit. I start off in English when they're at the beginning of the year, what book am I reading? And then I transition to Latin. But I'm always showing them I'm constantly reading, and I'll erase it and put a new title up in front of them, because I think it's important to demonstrate to them that it's okay to read and to keep reading and to find pleasure in it. Because the more that they find pleasure in the stories of the Cambridge Latin course, the more effectively you're going to be able to teach the Latin language. Of course, the other statistic here is that students' literacy levels are dropping in America. I saw some harrowing statistic on Facebook. I couldn't find the source behind it, and so I don't have an actual number, but I know that levels of language acquisition and reading comprehension are at a low that has not been tested in America since like the early 90s or something like that. So you're free to do a educational deep dive research of your own to find out more statistics about that. But the bottom line is our kids are coming to our classroom not necessarily having parents who are reading in their free time, who are not reading themselves on their free time, who are reading, quote unquote, for perhaps their own English classes, but really only books that they're told to read. And even then, we really can't assess whether or not they're reading everything that they're being told to, or whether they're, getting a Cliff Notes or a Spark Notes type of version of it. So we are up against some really challenging circumstances, and we have an obligation then to bring our students into our class and read with them and show them that there is so much to be gained from the experience of reading. Because the other thing that they need to do from the experience of reading is to learn Latin. So we have to really consider what we're up against, and then create opportunities for our students to learn within those parameters. So a couple of priorities that will be emphasized in a variety of different ways tonight is first, continue the narrative. The narrative was written in an engaging way by the folks at Cambridge University, or the Cambridge School Classics Project, in such a way that they want to hook kids in, right? They wrote these stories and we all love them. And our job is really to keep that narration alive and going so that our students learn to love it too. Make it lively, right? It's one thing to, in this graphic that's here on the slide, it's one thing to, pop kids down in comfortable seating and say, okay, go read something on your own. But they're not necessarily, listen, given those statistics, they might not even know how to, or they don't exercise that idea very often of just sitting and reading for pleasure. So we have to make our class activities really engaging and full of life so that they are attaching themselves to the plot line, to the narrative, and ultimately to the Latin language. Involve the students in whatever way. So even if it's a situation, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, where you might be reading a story to your students, involve them somehow. Make them a part of that experience and demonstrate for them the virtues of being a part of the narrative and being sort of alongside the characters that you're reading about. Utilize the plot and the characters to sort of drive the development, and utilize them to build comedy, to build tragedy, to build pathos, to build a bunch of different skills and conversations within your classroom. Model engagement. As I said, I think that we are all here tonight because we use the Cambridge Latin course, but I guess I can't speak for you. We don't just use it, we love it, right? That's why we're here. That's why we've chosen to adopt this text into our classroom. So the more you show that you love the characters, or not even love, but just, you have deep feelings for the characters. The more that you can demonstrate that to the students, the more they themselves will also realize, okay, well, we are all in this together. We all collectively dislike Eutychus. We all collectively, support Quintus as he's trying to save Cogidobnus, right? So there are a bunch of ways in which you can kind of get the students on your side by showing them how you also feel about the plot points, etc. This is an important point because with fifth edition, which is what most of us are using right now, there is a sixth edition book coming out. Maybe some of you have been fortunate enough to have that in your schools. But I know for fifth edition users, I've heard on a couple of different occasions, and this is not a negative piece of commentary, but like there are some people in Unit 3 who don't like the Modestus and Strithio storyline. And so if you don't like it, I can understand that maybe you don't. However, I think it behooves you with your students to, fake it for a while, pretend, find whatever virtue you can in their storyline and sell it to the kids as much as you can, because they do pick up on your cues. And so if you're kind of dismissing it like, "Oh, yeah, okay, it's one of those Modesta stories again," they're going to pick it up and they're going to also dismiss it, even if you don't necessarily intend for them to do it. So it is really important to model that aspect of being engaged with the stories and the character and the plot line. And then finally, I think to that extent that I was just discussing, I think it's really important to be the student's guide on their side. So you are the Latin teacher. You do know these stories inside and out, and you could probably find the page number without even looking. You could probably recite lines and quotes and stuff from within Cambridge Latin course. But try to imagine what it's like for them to view Eutychus for the first time. Try to imagine what it's like to to see King Cogidobnus interacting with Quintus for the first time. Try to be alongside the narrative with them, because the students, I believe, will feel that too. Even if I know you've probably done this maybe 25 or 30 years of getting to know Eutychus, I think the more that you can present it to them as, we are all on this reading journey together, I think that the more invested your students will be. So I'm peppering this whole presentation with a ton of different ideas for you for activities that you can use in your classroom. My hope is that at the end of tonight, you have at least one thing, maybe more, but at least one thing that you could potentially use in class tomorrow. But we are all very disciplined teachers. We probably all already have our lesson plans done for tomorrow. But it would be possible that you could use one of these activities on Monday, and maybe you can rework something that you're sort of tired of using your same old thing. Maybe you might feel inspired to use something that I'm presenting tonight. So as I have a few general suggestions, and then I'm going to be going into one stage from each of the units and providing not a lesson plan, but just a series of suggestions that you could use to keep all of those priorities alive in terms of moving the narrative and keeping kids engaged. I told you I'm a yapper. So the first activity, it really leans into where kids are, making Instagram posts, making an Instagram account for either the story or the character or the stage itself. Lean into the kids' abilities to make reels. Now, I do understand that cell phone usage in school is becoming more and more limited, as it should, right? I'm in full support of that. But these kids can still film videos using their devices. And they're always, I think no matter what the age, they're always game to like act stuff out in some degree. I said Instagram posts and reels. They could also make TikToks or other sorts of videos. And they can be inspired by influencers that they regularly follow and see on both Instagram and TikTok. And if you happen to know any of those influencers, which I'm going to be honest, I really don't. I'm not that old, but I'm not that young either. And I'm kind of in that bubble where I know that they're influencers, but I couldn't tell you who they are. But perhaps you could tap into, if your students happen to be talking about a particular influencer, you could say, okay, make a video in the style of influencer A. Netflix, right? So streaming services, they are near and dear to our kids' hearts. So as they think about the stories, encourage them to think about it from the perspective of what would this show look like if you were going to binge it this weekend, right? How many episodes would this stage have? What would you put into this episode? How would it look? What would be the cliffhanger at the end of the episode to, keep you in that like binging mode? This is how kids consume media these days, right? So tapping into that gives the students a way to connect to it. Social media is also full of what's called a clapback. And a clapback is basically when someone on social media sort of directly calls out someone either in the real world or in the social media world for doing something. And so a clapback is, a cleverly worded tweet or X statement. I don't know exactly what you call it these days. Or an Instagram video that sort of, is a response, if you will, to something that is happening or something that someone said. And then, of course, memes. We all at least know memes, right? No matter how old we are, we at least are familiar with the idea of memes. Kids still love memes. That's something that really has not lost its attraction in the last few years as other forms of media have begun to become more popular. So definitely use memes throughout your class. Use them to interpret stories, use them to retell stories, use them to, encapsulate the experience of a story. Maybe match the meme to the story or something like that, or, match the character to the meme that they might say at the end of the story, or, whatever sort of arrangement you want to do. So those are some like super modern oriented options for you to, again, keep that narrative fresh and flowing for your students. So as we go through each of the stages, I want to sort of preface with some general provisos, if you will. Anytime you're starting a new unit, start with the teacher's manual. It is a wealth of information in terms of what to tackle, how to tackle it, what to skip. And I do use that term lightly, and we'll get back to that term in just a moment. But the teacher's manual has really clear directions for each story. It also gives suggestions. So if you find that you are teaching a stage for the first time, maybe you switched preps with your colleague, maybe you're new to teaching in general. If you find that you are in a position where you're not comfortable teaching the story or you need a fresh start, use the teacher's manual because it has a lot of background information about each of the stories, and it provides ways of, getting the students hooked, reviewing different parts of the stories, or, breaking down a story into, thirds or whatever would be most engaging to the students. So, the teacher's manual, it's not as sexy as an Instagram clapback, but it at least gives you some direction in terms of how to look at the story. Your calendar is important too, right? So particularly tonight, I'm sort of addressing stages that have a lot of content. They have a lot of stories. And you might be thinking to yourself, oh boy, that is a lot of stories. That's a lot of text. How am I going to get through that? Really, the best indicator of how you're going to get through that is your calendar. How long do you have to get through that? Perhaps you're in a program where you're the only person, right? So if you meet your curricular goal in May or June, that's great. And if you don't, that's okay. You just inherit kids, your own kids next year who haven't gotten to the same point that they normally have because you happen to take an extra week with a stage. So you're the only and the best judge of how long you can spend on each of the stages, even if they have, tons of story-based content. Backward design. I'm a big proponent. I use this in a lot of my lesson planning. The basic gist of backward design is at the end of the stage, maybe I have a stage test. What do I want the students to be able to know in order to pass that stage test? What vocab should they be familiar with? What storyline would behoove them to know as they're approaching that test? So if you think that you could, skim through one of the 5 stories within a stage, but still get kids to the point of being proficient in that particular story that's on the stage test, then maybe you could do it like that. Or think about it in terms of vocabulary, right? If I want my students to acquire a certain number of words or a certain variety of words within a stage, is this story going to help me meet that goal or not? And if it's not, then maybe you could treat it differently and give a different type of assignment to your students based on that. And then finally, curricular goals. And I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but you know, I can't necessarily dictate for you how long you can spend on each stage and what you do with each of the stories, because you need to sort of pace it so that you can meet whatever goals are set for you, either by your colleagues or your, department supervisors, or again, if you're a solo practitioner, and it won't bother you if your students are a couple days behind or something like that. So those are all some like really general considerations. And now let's get our feet wet, shall we? Let's just jump into that deep end here. The first stage that we're going to do, again, I selected stages that were very heavy with readings. And so I selected stage 11 from Unit 1. I did one stage from each of the textbooks, or each of the units, I should say. Here's a quick list of everything that stage 11 has. And if you're a unit 1 teacher, you're probably nodding in, vehement agreement here. You start with model sentences, which are pretty, beefy as far as model sentences are concerned, because it's not just one picture, one sentence. It's, a little narrative below each of the pictures. Then you have the Quintus and Lucia story, which is 24 lines. Then you have a Sulla story, that's 29 lines. And then you have that 4-part story, Lucius Spurius Pompeianus. I think I spelled it incorrectly there. I apologize. And that 4-part story has a 23-line part, a 15-line part, a 26, and a 22. And as you're approaching to stage 11, I could imagine thinking, oh boy, that is a lot of Latin to get through. And then you finish that story and you get to Lucia and Metella, which is another 26 lines. And I can totally imagine that you're, quivering at the idea of having to go through that much in terms of the content of stories. I'm also coming at this webinar generally, and this was in the description too. If you have a grammar translation background, which I think most of us were probably raised with a grammar translation background in terms of how we ourselves learned Latin, it's not conducive. I mean, obviously the reading method itself is not linked to grammar translation. However, if you're doing grammar and translation with your students, you're going to lose their interest with an approach like this. If they have to, I mean, I can't do the math quickly enough, but that's a lot of just written translation just for this one stage. So remember, we want to keep kids engaged. We want to keep them learning. And so we want to keep that narrative flowing as quickly as possible. So we're not going to translate them. We're not going to do a lot of that like minutia oriented stuff. So what can we do then? As you go about looking at a stage and thinking, what am I actually going to do? Start with the teacher's manual. This teacher's manual says that the entire Lucius Spurius Pomponianus, I did spell it right that time. I apologize for my error earlier. That whole sequence of stories, all 4 parts, it could be skipped. Now, between all of us, the idea of skipping a story is not as literal as we would think. It's not like, oh, you can just turn the page and forget that it existed. You should address the story at some level with your students. However, the teacher's manual is saying to you, you don't have to spend as much time with that 4-part story as you do with some of the other stories. So that's an interesting thing to consider. So then what sort of activities could you do within your class so that you're still going over what's happening, but then, maybe you're not spending quite as much time? My proposal that's on the next few slides, it actually does not really skip over them at all. It actually considers it as like a full narrative arc. There are also digital resources. If you have subscriptions to Cambridge Elevate or Cambridge Go, check out having think questions for stories. Think questions are a great way for students to read through stories without having to read through the bulk of a story. It also gives students great sight practice in terms of looking at a text that they've never seen and answering questions about it. That is really good training for the stage tests that Cambridge has. But it's also a good Latin skill as kids are progressing through their various levels. So there are think questions available for 2 stories in the chapter. It is rare to have it for 2 stories, so definitely try to maybe take advantage of the digital resources that are available to you. And honestly, the think questions are not necessarily Googleable answers, so they are something that you could give as like a homework assignment to have the students complete. The other advantage to stage 11, as bulky as it is, a lot of those stories have interactions between characters that could be dramatic retellings. And I know that that's like a pretty easy answer, and you're probably like, all right, Steph, like tell me something I don't know. But it is important to consider that a lot of these stories have interactions between 2 characters. I mean, just the fact that 2 of the stories have 2 characters as the title, right? So it involves a lot of interaction between the 2. And then Lucius Spurius Pomponianus is a lot of dialogue back and forth. And then also, as you're contemplating how am I going to get all the readings in, rest assured that the language lesson of stage 11 is question words. So, I mean, there's also a little bit about dative with special objects, but that's nothing that's like a huge undertaking, I think, to teach and to demonstrate to the students. The language lesson of question words, though, actually helps you as you're executing your lesson plans for this chapter, because you can use those question words as you prepare students for readings, guide them through it, etc., and you can model a lot of the usage of those question words. Okay, so here's a plan. I did make it a capital A on purpose because I don't want you to think that this is, the only way you could teach stage 11. I'm here to try to give you some support and some suggestions as you're considering how to be the best person that you can be. Day 1, model sentences. Now remember, the model sentences are pretty substantial in these. And the first model sentence basically says that all the candidates or all the citizens are in the forum and they're listening to the candidates' speeches. And it's a very short introduction. Then you have a series of people, like groups of people in the forum who are supporting a variety of different candidates, and they're essentially talking to each other as a group. So the bakers have one candidate that they support, the robbers have another candidate that they support, and so on and so forth. So you could divide the students into groups. This does fall into the category of dramatic retelling, but you could use question words, which was the topic of the stage, to ask students what type of person is in each group. And then each group takes whatever is in the model sentences and they speak as a group to the other groups as if they themselves are the bakers and the robbers and the merchants, etc. And then because it's an election-oriented stage, if you are at some point near an election day, whether it's federal, state, local, whatever you want to do, you can kind of liken that to the candidacy that is happening around the students themselves. All right, and then day 2. The Quintus and Lucia story, in which they're fighting over which candidate to support. And Quintus is basically like, this is our family candidate and we can't possibly think of any other candidate. You could use the think questions here to sort of draw the students through the story. And then perhaps at the end of the think questions, ask a single reflection question that asks the students to summarize the story and to potentially evaluate Quintus's statements and Lucia's statements against or in comparison to the statements made by the candidates or the groups of people supporting the candidates in the forum from the model sentences. And then perhaps, the think questions don't allow for a whole lot of vocabulary focus. So perhaps you could play a vocabulary game with the new words that are glossed on the side of the story as some of the featured vocab, obviously not the only ones. All right, day 3, work with the Sulla story. The Sulla story is, just to refresh your memory, I apologize if you're so familiar with the stage that you could recite this story on your own. Basically, this painter comes by to paint this campaign slogan sign, and each of the siblings pay him a different fee to paint their own candidate's sign over their house. And Sulla makes out like a bandit. But the kids don't know that because, you know, they're teenagers and they're just sort of asking for what they want at that time. So I recognize that you might think, oh, it's just a dramatic retelling, but there's a spin on it, and that is the Academy Awards. And the Academy Awards would be given to the group that acts out the story the best. So you have a group of four. In each group of four, you have a director who's going to direct the whole scene. You have actors for Lucia, Quintus, and Sulla. And then you can give the kids time to work on their interpretation of what happens with Sulla, and grab your French teacher colleague or grab your principal or something like that, have them come in for the last 10 minutes of class. Everybody performs their version of the story, and then someone gives out an Academy Award. And you could even make it fun and have an actual award, something from Oriental Trading Company or something like that, like a little trophy that says, best acting in period 4 or something like that. After Sulla comes the Lucius Spurius Pomponianus, and it's a 4-story thing. As I said, I did not take my own advice about potentially skimming it or skipping it. And instead, I created a series of station activities. Excuse me, sorry, I have a little frog in my throat. And then the students can move to each of the stations. Each of the stations would be devoted to one of the 4 parts of the story. And whereas it's a funny story and it definitely has movement from the first mini story to the last, students don't necessarily have to do it in that order to understand the humor of the situation. The way I've designed the station activity, there's also a point of reflection and encapsulation at the end of it so that students can kind of think about, well, what did I just read? And, how does the sequence benefit my understanding of the story? So here are the stations that I would suggest. Station 1, in Willa, make me laugh. This is a relatively new activity that I've been doing. So cogite me ridere, make me laugh about something. So I want them to add something in English to every line of that particular story to make me, who's reading it, laugh a little bit. All right. Maybe not, fall out of my chair laughing, but something that changes it just slightly, that it makes me laugh. So, uh, I can't think of a funny example. I'm not that funny of a person, but nor do I have the in Willa memorized at this point. But perhaps you could use some sort of like slang expression. On a very micro level, I wouldn't necessarily suggest this, but like if the kids ended the sentence with like, "What do you think, bro?" I know that that's not like specifically funny, but that could be something that the kids would add in. But they'd have to add in something that works with that line of dialogue. So they do have to still understand what's being said for each of those lines. The next one is in foro, and that is where all the candidates are, or all the people who are voting really are lining up and advocating for their particular candidate. I think this would be a great opportunity for soliloquies. So the students take a selfie video as each character. They have to say their lines, but they can't say their lines in the same voice for each character because the merchants want something different than the bakers do. So they have to be able to differentiate. And that differentiation, that's where you get reading comprehension. That's where you as a teacher can assess whether or not the students really understand what they're reading. Prope ampe theatrum. Sorry, this little word did not fit on my clipboard all at the same time. But create fan fiction. Develop backstories about the 3 main groups or characters within the story. So the bakers, why did they come together and support them? Did they have a meeting? Did they all finish baking first? Like what brought them to support this candidate? What sort of secret allegiance or alliance do they have? What is it about baking that causes them to support off-air? Give some backstory on the bribe agent. I mean, the bribe agent, that sounds like a crazy job title to have, right? So how did he get involved in this? And what is his life like? Does he enjoy his work or is he annoyed by the candidates that he has to work for. So dig into that. And again, that shows you that your students are really understanding what's going on, but it also gives them a creative way to engage in the story. And then, of course, Afer, who's one of the primary candidates, what's his motivation? How did he get to the political scene? Was he born into it? Does he have family expectations that he's having trouble fulfilling? I'm just sort of spitballing here, but these are ways in which the students can make these stories come to life. And then finally, In Kulina is the fourth story in the sequence, and Clemens calls Grumio on Grumio's, false presentation as his other candidates. And they don't have a fight in any sort of like knockdown, drag out sense, but perhaps you could divide the kids into teams and have them cheer for or support Clemens and Grumio. So Team Clemens, why do you think he is right about what he's saying to Grumio? And Team Grumio, why is he right, or at least not wrong according to Clemens, right? I mean, it's just two friends having a conversation, but it would be interesting to see how the kids react. After they've done all four stations, I think it might be interesting for them to do a reflection, not only on the sequencing of the stories and the characters and whatnot, but place that story or the storyline in the context of slaves in Roman society. To what extent would this type of scene be likely or unlikely for, real Roman slaves to be doing? And what is it about the nature of Grumio, like specifically Grumio, and Clemens' lives that would make this story funny? So this encourages kids to look at the trajectory of all that they know about Grumio and all that they know about Clemens and reflect on what makes these two men who they are, and therefore what about their relationship comes out with that sense of humor in this sequence of stories. And then, assuming you feel like you've done LSP well enough, then you can engage in Lucia and Metella. And for this, we've done a lot of sort of active engagement for the rest of the story, so it might be fine to sit and do a popcorn reading. And as you do a popcorn reading of the story, you, the teacher, can ask questions. You can, again, practice question words. You can ask the students to ask questions of each other using question words. So this is, again, a proposal. You do what you want with it. Let's talk a little bit about Unit 2, Stage 18. So this is a different stage. I feel like, I tried to not have a lot of overlap in terms of the activities that I was suggesting so that you could let your mind wander and you could start thinking about, what story you were going to be reading in your class next week that perhaps you could adapt if you wished. So stage 18, on the surface, you're like, oh, it doesn't have model sentences. Great, it'll be an easy stage. It is not an easy stage in terms of stories because there are 5 of them and they're all relatively the same length. And so again, it can be a really cumbersome type of thing to look at this and just see tons and tons of text. And it's cumbersome for your students, right? They get to stage 18 and they're like, who's this Eutychus guy? Oh my God, there's 5 stories about him. How do you keep the kids in the pocket of someone who's learning the language while they're learning about Eutychus without getting bogged down in how much Latin there actually is? So here's my sort of typical plan for stage 18. Day 1, that Taberna story, it is one of the shorter ones, but I do story time. And this graphic is here for a reason. And the reason is when I do story time with my students, there's a great YouTube of like, I think it's like 10 hours of a cozy fireplace. It even makes like crackling sounds like a fireplace. And I put that on the projector. I put that on the back screen, full screen. Sometimes I turn out the lights and I read them a story. And I read it in Latin, I'll read it in English, I'll summarize it, I'll ask the kids questions, but it's definitely teacher led, but I kind of want to give them this idea that there's a nice cozy atmosphere for reading a story and hearing a story. And in a sense, I also feel like, I teach high school, so I have all, middle teenagers. I'm not their mom, I know that, but I like sort of creating that idea that like mom is reading them a story or like their parent is like taking care of them and like it's nighttime and are about to go off to bed or whatever. No, I don't want them to sleep in class, but I do want them to get that level of comfort in the classroom and also to know that this kind of reading, it doesn't have to be super complicated Latin. It can also just be a story. All right, so with day 2, as far as our story trajectory goes, we read Inofficina Eutyche Part 1. So that's where Clemens finds out that his shop has been ruined and demands to go to Eutychus's workshop. And then he gets there, and they're the 4 Egyptian slaves who are guarding it, and he just like bustles right past them, like, no, I don't care about your obstacle. I need to see this guy. I have them do a director's cut per Netflix. So this is what I was mentioning before. I said, okay, imagine that stage 18 or unit 2 is, up for a full season at Netflix. You're the director of this scene. So the students have to create dialogue for a small paragraph where there is no dialogue. So like, what would Clemens actually say? Even though there's no quotation marks, what would he be wearing? How would you style this scene? What type of expression should he be wearing? There's a big crowd that's all really upset about Clemens' shop. So what does the crowd sound like? And the big part of the director's cut is the why. So why does Clemens, if you say that Clemens should have a certain facial expression, why? And part of that they can base in Latin, but part of that they can just say, oh, well, he should be really angry because his shop is burning right now, or whatever the story suggests. So it's a way of getting them not to just say, oh yeah, no, Clemens should be smiling because he's happy. Well, why is he happy, right? So that again dips into that awareness of their reading comprehension skills. With the second part of the same story, I give the students an illustration. So I take out most of the highlights, I guess you could say, but also the more, I'm going to make up this word, drawable parts of the story. Not every sentence is something that can be illustrated really easily. So I have them illustrate some of the major points of the story. And then I do have them do a little bit of a vocabulary review to look at some of the words that were glossed as they were illustrating the more primary parts of the story. It should be noted that after we do activities like this, I do check through it with them to make sure that they're getting, at least the major plot points, or, the big surprise at the end, or like the funny thing that happened or something like that. Because sometimes kids go along with what their friends are doing, and they don't necessarily know why they're doing this director's cut or whatever. But I think if we go over it, then the kids are like, oh, okay, all right, that's why I was drawing it like this. All right, so continuing, for Clemens Tarbonarius, I will have the students read the story together and then do the comprehension questions from the blue box that's, in the textbook that's adjacent to the stories. And I hope you don't think that that's a cop-out, but I mean, sometimes we're tired. There's only so many activities that you can create with the hours that are available in your day. And those comprehension questions are great. They get to the heart of the story. They do get the students to engage in the text without having to, go through every single word. Around this time in the students' Latin careers, I guess you could say, in our program, I do have them start to give Latin support for their answers. So, if their answer is, Clemens was a nice guy, well, what in the story gave you that idea? And at this level, it's okay for them to cite, lines 2 through 5 or something like that. But it's a skill that they're going to need to build up to. Our school has AP as our terminal class, and in that level of class, you do have to be able to make a point about a text and then prove it with Latin evidence. At the AP level, it's a much more focused Latin citation, but this at least gets them into that idea that they have to be able to prove their answers with the Latin that's available to them, rather than just, a hunch that they might have. One of the things that I do with Clemens Tarbonarius is after they read it, I have them do this thing. I'm going to click on it, and if you have a link to the presentation, you can click on this as well. So I have them do this thing. This is a fairly popular meme, if you will, that is on the interwebs. I give them an example of how this meme gets perpetuated. So if you were to tell people you were a science student, this is how your friends see you, this is how your family sees you, etc. You get the gist here. So after that story, you know, Clemens is really falling into a new life when he is in Egypt. And so based on what they learn about his new life in that story, how do people see Clemens? How do the shopkeepers see him? How do the priests see him? How does Isis see him, etc.? And this gives the kids an idea that, you know, Clemens is a part, but a very vibrant part of the fabric of Alexandrian society. He's not just a freed slave. He is someone who has his own existence. He's making his own choices, etc. And this kind of allows the kids to home in on, you know, the various aspects, excuse me, of Clemens. And it also, you know, when we brought back Clemens in stage 16, when Kagidovna said, like, how'd you get here? We knew that he was a freedman. This adds many more, you know, human dynamics to who Clemens is and what type of character he is. And that's going to be, I think, important for the students' perception of slavery as a whole. Okay. And then we do pro taberna clementis, which, if you remember from my line analysis last slide or 2 slides ago, there's a lot of lines of Latin in that story. So I will frequently use like a pear deck and go through it. The pear deck that I have, I'm pretty sure was originally written by Becky Bush. It was part of that shared spreadsheet that was created during the COVID lockdown. I think I've edited it a little bit more for my own purposes by now. But an interactive pear deck could also be or become a quizzes. Although if you're a quizzes fan, you are also probably disappointed, like me, to know that they renamed quizzes Wayground over the summer, which is a totally lame name, but it still does the same stuff. Wayground has the same type of interactive question techniques, but it actually has more than Pear Deck even. It allows you to rearrange things into the right order. So you could have the students take a sentence translation and say, okay, here's the English version, you know, put the Latin of the original text into the order that the English version is. So that's a little bit of vocab, a little bit of language. You can also you can match pictures. There are multiple choice questions too. It's like partially gamified, but it is also an assignment that you can give based on mastery. So you can encourage students to, you know, continue to get better as they're reading. So no matter which software tool you use, getting the students to interact with it, but also, you know, in a way that they can get an answer wrong and it's okay, right? So in Pear Deck, they can get an answer wrong and it's all anonymous on the screen. So we can talk about what the wrong answers were, maybe why they were wrong, and then help them improve on their reading comprehension as they're going through. All right, and finally, we come to Unit 3, Stage 28, another doozy. Stage 28 is, I'm actually going to skip to the right side here. The plot line of stage 28 is the last one that's in Britain. So we do want to make sure that we give stage 28 the gravitas, if you will, that it deserves. And there's a lot of reading in it, though. So the teacher's manual says that Testamentum, which is the first story, can be skipped. But Testamentum, that story is the will of King Cogidebnus, and it's the first story that gives us the indication that Salvius was actually driving this whole operation the whole time. So why would you, is what I wrote. I feel like it is a really pivotal story that is that helps the students really start to question, like, what actually is happening here? Like, I thought, you know, one of the biggest takeaways for the kids is, why didn't he give Quintus anything, right? We have the entirety of the second half of book 2 being narrated to Quintus, and he doesn't give him anything in the will. That's weird. The language lesson of stage 28 is pretty light. It involves ablative phrases. So it's something that you could address in like maybe a half a class, maybe a full class, but you can then spend quite a bit of time in the other classes within stage 28 working with the stories themselves. And then there are a lot of stories, though. There's even the model sentence. model sentences, excuse me, they have their own mini story. That's the ultio romana. So that unto itself is an important plot point that you don't want to skip over, and you want to make sure that you're giving it a lot of airtime for your students. So just a few ideas, and this is not necessarily going to be as thorough, perhaps, but hopefully you have some other ideas from previous slides. For the testamentum story, make a video where Cogidobnus is writing his will. That instead of skipping the story, you put the perspective in the hands of Cogidobnus. So why is Cogidobnus choosing these things to give to the people that he's giving them to, right? Like he gives Agricola a statue of himself. Like that's a weird thing. So what kind of thought process would Cogidobnus have that causes him to give himself to Agricola, right? So it's an interesting take because we all know that the will is false. In Aula Salvii, Aula, excuse me, is where Bulimachus starts plotting against Salvius, and Salvius starts getting wind of it, and then he asks his friends for advice on what to do. And every time we get to this point in the story, I ask my students, do you really think that he has friends? You know a lot about Salvius by now. Do you think he's got friends, or do you think he has people who are around him who are terrified to go against him because they know that what could happen? So maybe take that story and rewrite it from the perspective of Salvius's friends. What is it like to be his friend, knowing that someone else, Bulimachus, who's really close to him, is actively plotting against him? You know, what sort of text messages are they exchanging with each other when they're like, oh my God, what do we do? You know, how do we support him? But also he's a jerk. So like, I kind of want to join the conspiracy that Bulimachus has started, you know, whatever dimension you want to give the kids, I think would be really helpful for them to identify with a lesser known or lesser acknowledged character, but, you know, retell the story from that perspective. The third story is, well, if you don't count the model sentence story, but the next story is Cana Salvii. So Salvius invites Bulimachus over for dinner, a dinner at which he's eventually going to poison him and kill him. But maybe have a dinner party in your class. You know, you could incorporate a lesson on Roman food and have people, you know, make things or bake things or whatever. And then during the dinner party, you can have two kids act as Salvius and Bulimachus in sort of a fishbowl environment. So, you know, you randomly choose like popsicle sticks. So for the first, you know, paragraph or something like that, you know, kid A is Salvius, kid B is Bulimachus, and they have to go into the middle. And as they're enjoying their dining and their grapes or whatever you're bringing in for this meal, have them exchange conversation in the same way that Salvius and Bulimachus are. So it's sort of a dramatic retelling, but it's got a lot more of a cultural element because you're sort of building on other you know, ideas. In the last story, it's Bulimachus Rex. It's where Bulimachus ultimately does indeed die. Depending on how you do that story, I actually like to do that story as sort of a live event where students are, it's like a popcorn reading, but students are live sort of translating. They're all taking a sentence here and there. But as a fun after activity, Bulimachus gets to the underworld. And now he's faced with the team of judges, Rhadamanthus, Minos, and I always blank on the third judge. I'll think of it eventually. Plead his case, right? The judges are there. They're about to, you know, potentially send him to Tartarus. How is he going to plead his case that he really should go to the Elysian Fields because he really didn't know what he was doing? So you can kind of make a play for Bulimachus at that angle. So finally, I want to leave you some other general options that are not stage or story specific. I am a proponent of using AI in education in you know, limited and purposeful capacities. So you could use AI to generate images of stories and then have students produce Latin captions that have quotes from the story. This might be something that you've done before, but I think AI, depending on your software, it could be actually a much more precise way of getting to some of the more fine plot points. And then if you like the idea of using AI to generate images, you can do two parallel activities, either class one, you know, period 1 versus period 5, or within the same class. You have some kids who are captioning from images that are already created, and then some kids who are illustrating, and then have them team up, do a jigsaw type of arrangement to say, okay, this is how I illustrated it. And then the student who has an illustration says, this is how I captioned it, and see how close they come to each other. And that might be an interesting way of them sort of, joining the visual elements together. And then you might have even heard of this particular activity idea to adapt stories to modern speech trends, right? So I know, so teenagers, they have a lot of what's called brain rot, right? We've heard it in our classrooms. You've been very puzzled as to why they're saying things like 6, 7. So make them incorporate some of those and have some fun with the stories, and bring the stories to a level that they would easily retell to each other. So those are some like generalized options that are not specific to any of the stories or stages that I shared. In case you thought, I don't have enough ideas by the end of our webinar tonight, I have you covered. There are 2 resources that I want to share. The first one is the menu. So in the 2024 summer workshop series, Katie Reddick and Michelle Romalo and I designed a menu of different storytelling or story learning options for you. And I would encourage you to go through this list. I mean, there's not enough time in the day to go through all 50 something ways of reviewing a story. And these are all sorted, I think, nicely according to preparation time, interaction of whole class, partner, individual, whether the story version is a learning or what learning skill it is, what your goal is for it. So definitely give this a good look. And then the other resource that I want to give to you is Ditch That Textbook. Matt Miller, he's actually a Spanish teacher, and he wrote a book rather called Ditch That Textbook years ago. It's one of the things that has sort of revolutionized my own thinking about my own classroom. And basically it's, move beyond the textbook and do non-traditional activities. And I've sent you to his template page, specifically social media templates. He has these templates for both Google Slides as well as PowerPoint, and they are templates that you can use in your class instantly. And they will provide, this website alone will provide a lot of inspiration for you as to how you could possibly incorporate some of these alternative story reading techniques in your classrooms. So like an Amazon product page, learn like an influencer, Spotify Wrapped. I actually used this as soon as he published it last year. That was the same time that we finished Unit 2 as like a textbook. And so I had my students make a Spotify Wrapped for Unit 2. So I had them, the most used language concept. I mean, you could probably, there are probably different opinions on what's the most used one, but the number of minutes that I spent reading, the number of characters that there are, whatever you wanted to put into that template. So Ditch That Textbook has a ton of templates for you to use. So ultimately, because I know I'm in my final moment, a quick conclusion with a couple of primary takeaways. First, there are literally dozens of ways to get students to read and to keep them interested in the things that we are requiring and asking them to read. Variety will help generate sustained engagement. And so I hope that this gives you a lot of variety in terms of how you envision your own classroom. So that's me. That's my email address. I'm more than happy to continue this conversation with you at another time. If you have questions or comments, if you have live questions, you can raise them now as well.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. So many excellent suggestions. And I really like the 3 stages that you picked in each of the 3 units. Does anybody in our audience have a question for Stephanie?
I don't have a question, but I do have something I would like to share, if I may.
Yes, please.
Okay, just a little bit of background. I teach in a Title I school system.
Mm-hmm.
We have the largest migrant education system in the state. We're also the #1 agriculture producing county in the state.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a very small percentage of students who go on to a university study. I'm talking like maybe 20%. So the
Mhm.
and the largest department in my high school was the special education department.
Mhm.
So having said all that, I'm going to share something with you all.
Okay.
And it's called, let me find it real quick. As soon as I find it. Yeah, there it is. Okay, it's a document called the Rules of Notice. Now, what this is, since all of us are good readers, all of us read for pleasure, these are the sort of innate things that we do when we read. Okay.
Okay.
But like for instance, the in stage 11 with the with Grumio playing his character, there is occasions where like Claymanes will make that one little smart comment like, such and such is a very generous person.
Mhm.
Okay. The kids don't really get that because it's in text. But if you
Okay.
can use these rules to kind of help them understand to look for those sort of things, to look for things like ruptures, changes in person, changes in like scenery, point of view, if there's a little things like that, it's not necessarily designed to make them enjoy reading, but to help them become a more effective reader. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Okay. But anyway, I've shared it with you in the chat. It's got some really good stuff. Of course, and like I taught language arts for 15 years, and a
Mhm.
lot of my time spent teaching was with the lower level students.
Mhm.
So this is some of the stuff that I've gleaned that I apply into my classroom because believe it or not, the majority of my students taking my class are not the students who should really be taking Latin, believe it or not.
Mhm.
So, but
Yeah.
I've adopted this among some other things that I do within my program, coming again from a 15-year language arts program.
Mhm.
Where if there's anything that I can throw in there to help them understand the concept, whether it be like metonymy or synecdoche, or maybe how we can use imagery in the language to create a picture in the mind, I
Mhm.
do all that. So, but
Excellent.
again, I just wanted to share this with you guys.
Thank you.
If
Graham, I don't see it in the chat. Have you put it in there yet?
I guess I did. There it
Okay.
goes. Okay, yeah, there it is.
I feel less
So,
stumped. Thank you.
no, not a problem, not a problem. But again, this is some really, really powerful things to help bridge some of that gap between just reading the Latin and understanding the Latin.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so I just wanted to share that with everybody.
Yeah.
I
Thank you
thought
so
that
much,
would be
Brian.
important. No, no, not a problem, not a problem.
Very cool. And Stephanie, can you address this little bit, the social media question, which you did do it in the chat, but would you explain it
Oh
out
yeah.
loud?
So I know teachers and students are not supposed to have social media interaction, right? So you're not supposed to like be friends with your student on Facebook or anything like that. But there are ways that if a student creates a profile on a social media platform, they can send you a link to the profile itself without you having to follow them or friend them or anything like that. So they just have to make sure that their account is public and not private. So in theory, if they're designing their own social media account that is modestus for the sake of, stage 25 or something like that, you can still see what they're doing in terms of the content without having to follow them yourself. You can just kind of like do a thing. Some students don't like a public thing because it's linked to their other Instagram. And then they're like, well, my friends are going to see it. And you're like, okay, well, just make it public for the one day that we're all going to look at it in school. And then you make it private again and you can junk it after that. So there are some ways. And then also the Ditch That textbook has some templates for social media that are not actually on social media, but it mimics that experience too.
Good to know. Thank you so very much. On that note, we would like to say thank you everybody for attending this evening. Again, if you need a certificate for attending this evening, please email us training@cambridgelatin.org. And Stephanie, thank you so very much. That was
Thank you.
great.
Thank you. It
Yes.
was a pleasure being with you all tonight. Thanks for taking time out of your day.
Want to set up
Yes.
two? It's in the chat. I'll post it one more time, but we have two more coming up.